Good morning, everybody. This is Matthew Townend from Cavell. We're going to start now. There's going to be a few people, I'm sure, who will join as we move through the session. So thank you for those who've got up early and some of those who are getting up late in the afternoon. So we've got a very mixed audience with people from all around the world. So really appreciate your attendance. I'm going to, as I say, in the room we have with me Scott Goodwin, who's a VP of Unified Communication from PCCW. So I'm going to take you through about a 15-20 minute presentation on our findings around what's happening in terms of globalization in the UCaaS market. And then Scott's going to give a quick update on what PCCW are doing in this space. So with no further ado, we shall begin. I know most of the people on the call, but for those who don't know who we are, the Cavell Group is a specialised research and consulting business who are focused around the whole move to IP and cloud communications. We work with providers in terms of providing research, training, consulting right around Europe and indeed in Asia, the Middle East and Africa as well. So I know a lot of you know us already. Some of you who know me will see this picture and think that's probably Matt 10 years ago, but I tend to use the same picture because I don't want to see that I'm aging. I'm the Director of Research and Consulting at Cavell Group. As many of you know, I've been tracking this market for over 12 years now, leading major consultancy projects and research projects around the world, and spend a lot of my time talking to service providers and working with service providers on their international strategy. So if we look at the case for global UCaaS, what's really driving the increased demand is really four major factors. We're generally seeing a growth in cloud services, both in communications and computing. We're also seeing now the mid-market and large enterprise adopt. And obviously their requirement for multinational is very different to the early market, which we saw with the small businesses in most markets. So we're seeing an increased requirement from those mid-market and large enterprises who also have a different requirement in terms of the level of service. We're also seeing generally an increase, and we'll talk through some interesting facts and figures we've got on this, in the focus of businesses on multinational business. So we've got some data which we're going to share in terms of the picture of companies and how many multinational sites they have. And of course, probably the other thing that is affecting us all is the competition that's emerging, particularly focusing on offering international services. So we've seen a number of UCaaS players appear in the market in the last couple of years who are now building out international services and talking to, I guess, some of your customers about those services today. And some of you are on the call, by the way, as well. So if we look at each of those factors quickly, with the audience I've got on this call, I probably don't need to convince you about the growth in cloud computing and communications. But if there's any of you who are still slightly unsure if it's really happening, we can look at some of the figures here. So we look at what Gartner are saying in terms of the overall public cloud services that covers a number of areas. They're seeing 18% growth just in 2017 and a market reaching 246 billion. Our own research, which I know a number of you purchase, you'll have seen in most of the major European markets, we're seeing CAGRs now of over 20% in the last 12 months, and some markets topping 30%. So we're seeing tremendous adoption of particularly cloud communications right now. Saying all of that, what we mustn't think is that all these markets are the same. At the same time, we see some very large differences in the terms of the way that markets are made up, regulatory regimes, and even neighbouring countries having very different adoption rates and market dynamics. As an example, in Europe, if we look at the Netherlands and Belgium, we'll see the Netherlands being one of the most advanced UCaaS markets, certainly in Europe and arguably in the world. And right next to it, we have Belgium, which is possibly one of the least developed certainly in mainland Europe. So we have to understand that when we talk about this, although we see a large growth, it's not, the markets are very different, and the need to understand those dynamics is still very important. So as we said, with the pressure that's really driving the requirement for UCaaS services is also the adoption of the mid-market and large enterprise. So initially, in most cloud communications markets, the small enterprise were the initial adopters. So if we look around the world, in most markets, it's not completely consistent, but in most markets, we see that the early market was driven by the SME. What we're now seeing in most markets is the medium and large enterprise really growing fast. And that's been driven by a number of factors. One of the factors is that the traditional PBX providers have now all realized the game is kind of up and have all started to launch their own services and give validation really to the cloud communications market. As an example, I just picked on a couple of companies here that you've probably heard of with recent reports. If we look at 8x8, some of you will know them. They reported that they've had a doubling in their mid-market revenue in the last year, and the share that their mid-market now has grown from 42% to 55%. So, a strong growth in that mid-market for them. And even companies like RingCentral as well, similarly saying that their 50-plus user market is up 93% year on year. So we're seeing the adoption of mid-market right across the board. And some of the traditional players and some of you are on the call here will be seeing that in your own customer bases. And with those mid-market customers, they have a different level of complexity and requirement to some of the smaller businesses. And one of those main requirements is what we're talking about now in terms of the requirement to offer multinational services. But also they have a different requirement in terms of the level of service and the type of service that they require from you. So growth in cloud, change in the dynamic towards mid-market is driving a requirement for global services. And as a consultant and analyst, people often ask me, well, how can you sort of size that market? And it's pretty hard to actually give a completely accurate sizing to the multinational market. But what we've got here on this slide is some of the latest research that we got from the European Union. And what it shows is the number of affiliates that companies have in other countries. So what you can see here is maybe not surprisingly for those who are aware of the European market, but France and Germany, for instance, have a large number of affiliates in other European countries. And an affiliate is an organization that the company has a controlling interest in, so maybe a subsidiary. So if we look at these figures, you can see French companies have over 20,000 affiliates in other EU countries, Germany with 13,000. And if we kind of try and put that into some sort of scale, just picking on the UK as an example, the UK would have around 40,000 40,000 companies with over 50 employees. And as you can see from this data, around 10,000 of those have affiliates. So you're fairly likely, if you're in the mid-market or large enterprise market, to be talking to a company that's got an affiliate in another country. Now, in the past, maybe that doesn't worry you. Yeah, they would buy their services locally. They couldn't really buy communications on a European basis that easily. But now, with the whole cloud dynamic, we're seeing providers offer services on a multinational basis to those customers. So if you're not offering it to your customer, somebody probably is. So what you can also see, some sort of the intricacies of the market here. You can also see that Germany has which is quite interesting for those who've been following recent politics. You can see that Germany actually has a large number of affiliates in the US market. So we shall see how the Merkel and Trump affair affects that. But from here, you can see, if you want some validation of the requirement for multinational, you can see it here in these figures. So I think that's a fairly strong indication that whether they're being served today or they will be served in the near future. So just to react also to competition, so the final factor we talked about in terms of the things that are driving this are competition. So what we've seen in the recent past is a series of players emerging with regional or global capability. So here's some statements from the press and that have happened in the last sort of year. We've seen Fuse, for instance, expand massively and investing heavily in their data centers around the world to provide a global service. We've seen people like Vonage buy Nexmo to provide them a CPaaS global service. We've seen 8x8 continue to expand their footprint. And we've seen acquisitions. So we've seen people like West Corp, who acquired Magnetic North in the UK to provide them with some European capability. So what we're seeing is competition emerging. Also, we've seen European competition like Enfon, who I haven't put on here, who operate now in 13 countries, German company. So your mid-market and large enterprise services customers have a series of potential options, and obviously more traditional players also like Vodafone and others are offering international services as well. But we're seeing a new breed of competition coming here, a new set of providers who we may not have been aware of 2 or 3 years ago even. So as part of this piece of research, and everybody who's on the call will receive a white paper that we've written, which has been sponsored by PCCW after the call. But as part of this, we talked to 15 different service providers about their attitudes or what were the issues that they were facing. So we've captured some of what we were hearing from service providers in their attitudes. And I guess the main thing to say was their attitudes changed dramatically based on a couple of things. One, the market they're serving. So in line with what we said earlier, some of the companies we were talking to are still serving very relatively small businesses, some of them with sort of average customer size of 10 and 12 customers. And their focus on offering a multinational service, not surprisingly, was fairly low, to be honest, because of that focus in terms of their company size. But the minute we started interviewing and talking to people focused higher up on the medium and larger size enterprise, their attitudes changed dramatically. And their focus on multinational was either their leading strategic issue or one of their leading strategic issues. So, as I say, massive difference in terms of the company focus they had. The other differences were based on location. So certain companies, as we mentioned earlier, certain companies, if you were a French or German provider, you're more likely to be focused on multinational. It's more you're more likely to have had that requirement than, let's say, if you're in some of the other markets, as we can see from the earlier charts. So location also impacted on service providers' attitudes. And as we said earlier, we can see German providers where generally the hosted market has been fairly, up to now, although there's been a number of announcements at CeBIT this week, has been relatively slow to adopt. There we saw a company like Enfon who really focused on multinational as their key differentiator. So depending on where you're from in terms of your location and depending on your company size, focus your requirements and your level of interest on multinational. But if you're focused on mid or large, it was either your key strategic issue or one of your key strategic issues that you were addressing. So we also asked people what their concerns were when they were thinking about offering a global service. And I'm not going to focus on all of these, but these are some of the top ones that came out of the research. And we split them really between technical and commercial concerns. And there's the obvious ones that any of us who have been in the market for a long time would pick up, things like numbering, the ability to offer emergency services, but also things like tax, billing, regulation, some of the possibly less obvious to those who haven't been in the market issues were some of the issues that were actually coming through the survey loud and clear. Also, things particularly actually interesting, service providers realized that there was quite a difference between the markets they were going to be entering. So knowledge of individual markets was something which was really important, and knowledge of specific regulatory or competitive situations. So, and finally, I guess the thing that's catched most people out when I talk to people who've offered European services is localization. And it's the silly little bits of localization that people aren't expecting. The way that people in certain countries use different parts of telephony is different. So having that localization right. I remember talking to a provider who was German, said everything was very Germanic, and when they were trying to bring that into different markets, it just didn't work. So that localization piece has proven really important. So what I wanted to do is talk about the current approaches that we're seeing in the market to serving global customers, because it's changing. In terms of the service provider decision-making process, and we often get involved in this with service providers, it's driven by a couple of things. Sometimes it's just driven by customer demand. They walk into that customer, or their salesperson walk into that customer and says, I have requirements for these other sites, and then they suddenly feel like they have to react. And quite often it's they pick the site with the hardest reach. So all of a sudden they want Kazakhstan as well as Germany and France. So it's often driven by customer demand. And then there's also an element of what is the service that the customer really wants. So do they want a consistent service? So when we're talking about these potential multinational offices where they've got users, do they want the same service unified way across all markets, or are they happy to receive a slightly different service? And this is one of the key issues actually we find when people are offering these services. Customers sometimes don't understand that there is a difference when they buy these services across market. The other thing that comes into this is often strategic intent. So often businesses have decided either that their market's too small and they want to expand, or they're looking to expand globally. And obviously the final thing is, what are the market dynamics? What is the opportunity in that market? So if I've got 5 customers who want BN support in a certain market, is that enough to really build a business case to operate in that market? So people really want to look at, is there a real market opportunity for them? So a combination of these factors then lead us really into 4 main routes that we see at the moment in terms of offering services. Obviously, the first one is the ability to acquire a provider. So we've seen particularly American companies in Europe acquiring quite a lot of companies to give them initial breach, initial presence, but people will choose to acquire a service. The second is telecoms companies being telecoms companies. They quite often want to build something, and particularly if it's being driven by a technical decision maker, quite often their first reaction, ignore how long it will take to come, is we can build. So we find obviously people making a choice in certain markets to build. And the third one, which is what PCW will talk to you about as well, is we're seeing now more outsource options, the ability to outsource to a third party. And we're seeing those options by service providers and vendors who are offering that ability to outsource the platform, either in your native market, right? Okay, in your home market, you're getting some more options like that, but particularly in the future when you're looking at multinational markets, that option to outsource. And finally, what a number of providers have done initially was to extend their services. So they have a platform in one geographic market, and what they do is extend its reach into other markets by just purchasing inbound numbers and emergency services in that market to give them an initial extended reach. So they are the kind of 4 major options that we see developing. So if we look at each of those, and we'll be sending you the white paper with more this detail in, so I'm not going to go through each bullet point. You'll be pleased to hear. But if we look at acquire, it's probably pretty obvious what the benefits are. You may get an existing customer base you obviously get local skills and knowledge around regulatory, etc. One of the things that we find is still you often have an integration issue in terms of you've acquired a platform, unless you're very lucky and acquired a platform which is exactly the same as the platform you're on, and the same version and the same implementation, you will have issues in terms of compatibility across those. And obviously, depending on the company you're looking to purchase, the cost of acquisition may be inflated. So we're seeing some inflated prices because you're acquiring a business that may not just be focused on the area that you're looking for. Build and manage, obviously you get control. You get control of the platform, which is why people like doing it. It's why telcos have traditionally like doing things, is they get control. Well, I guess couple of the biggest issues here have really been time to market. So depending on what platform you've got, what you're building, whether it's your own, whether it's a third party, I used to say, and maybe some people will shoot me down, but if you're building your own platform, I used to sort of say it would be 2 years from when you signed the PO before you got the service. I know that's changing because there's companies now that are able to help you integrate that and manage that, and a couple of them on the call. But there is still a definite time issue there. Also, sometimes we find that the short term, the cost of setting up may not be supported by the initial volumes of business. So you've suddenly got some international customers, and you've got a group of them who want service in one country. Does that really justify the whole build platform offer? So we see variations in this whole build now. Where do we put SBCs down? Do we put the whole platform, etc.? But there is a cost there. As I say, we're seeing some more outsource options. So partners you can work with, whether it's vendors or whether it's service providers like PCCW, and obviously that gives you speed to market, access to the local pieces, things like a company that understands potentially regulatory and tax issues, which we've highlighted in our research was quite a big issue. And on the negatives, obviously, there's an argument that longer term costs may be higher than having your own platform. But, more and more, I think we'll probably see some of the models that we've seen in other markets where, there'll be a manage, operate and transfer ultimately back to the provider, which will deal with that. But also we have, you have issues that the platform is defined, development is defined by your partner. So you have to have confidence and work closely with that partner, make sure it's developing in the right way. Extend has possibly been the way that most people initially entered geographic markets. And obviously getting an inbound number and routing the traffic to you gives you speed to market. So there's no, and a low cost because there's no initial platform issue. The main concern here potentially is the ability to provide consistent service levels. So depending where your platform is and where your end customers is, you still have issues potentially of distance and latency, which may affect the ability to provide the full UC service portfolio. So if you're offering a full UC sort of set of services, maybe the voice isn't affected so much by latency, but maybe some of the key other elements of that UC bundle are affected. Also, it's an issue that's not talked about much, but there are regulatory concerns and tax concerns here. Yeah, I think sometimes in the industry we kind of turn a blind eye to that in certain markets, but in terms of dealing with that's an issue. And obviously, you still have the localization issue with providers. You're still serving now customers in different markets who still have the same issues. So we're seeing those being the sort of four main ways. Now, what we generally see is that service providers develop a mixed strategy. So they'll choose to build and outsource in key markets, and they might choose to extend into Kazakhstan and the markets that they are difficult for them to reach. So we're generally seeing, if you look at most of the providers who have come into Europe or come into anywhere, actually Asia as well, you'll see they have this approach. So they'll build a couple of key hubs either by outsourcing or building, and then they'll extend into other markets utilizing other services. the service providers' options are increasing. So a little while ago, you really didn't have many options. We're seeing new options from wholesale white label options, and we're seeing vendor options that are giving us different choices here. But the thing that when we're working on consultancy projects with people on their international strategy, the platform is only one piece of the puzzle really here. So it's quite a complex puzzle as well when we look at billing, regulatory, language localization, how we're going to provide the service. That is only one part of the issue. And I guess the kind of elephant in the room we're seeing more and more is, how do you explain the variations in service to a customer? So a customer comes to you and says they want a global service. What they don't expect is it to be kind of very different, actually, in fact, in the way it's delivered. Your customers may be concerned that, the kind of regulatory position in a certain market isn't quite as clean as it could be. This is one of the areas that we're working a lot with vendors at the moment and service providers, is how do you explain to customers the differences in these services and when you're offering that service. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Scott, who's going to talk a little bit about PCCW and what we're doing in this area. As I forgot to mention, everybody is on mute. If you have any questions which you'd like us to answer, you can either contact us directly, or in the chat window below, you can send a chat to the organisers, and we will take some of those questions at the end. But for now, I'm just going to hand over to Scott, who's going to take you through PCCW.
Thank you, Matt. I will be as brief as possible. I realise I'm the support act to you. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar. Just to build on Matt's points earlier, I guess we're discovering that operating a global service is not straightforward. It is relatively difficult, and to do it on a consistent basis, even more so. I guess what this slide here is trying to demonstrate is, I guess, some of the key points that are required to achieve this aim. There's certainly a need for kind of local knowledge, which it requires deep relationships at an operational and commercial level in theatre and on the ground. Again, not just in terms of your partners and your ability to provide numbers or services. It's more down to having legal representation to be able to overcome some of the obstacles in that particular given market, for you to be able to supply and deliver services in that local market, for you to be able to import goods and services, be they handsets or whatever, in that local market, and not fall short of any import or export compliance obligations that you might have. Make sure that you have the appropriate regulatory cover that you would need. I think more importantly, having some feet on the ground, either in country or near country, to where it is that you're going to be offering the service. I think, having been in the telecoms industry for 25 years, it's safe to say the only thing that you can guarantee is it will go wrong, and how you then react to it is extremely important. And having people that have deep relationships and are local to the actual theatre of operation is a very important thing, particularly when you're talking about major customers in this mid-market that will take a very different approach if you fall short of your service obligations. So these are the challenges, I guess, that we've tried to outline today in this webinar. For those of you who are unaware of who PCC Global are, we're the international operating arm of Hong Kong Telecom. So by numbers, it's a company of around about 1,000 people. We are a wholesale sort of carriers or service providers carrier. Our DNA is very much made up around data and voice services. Revenues in and around or just short of $1 billion US. We have operations actual physical leases on buildings, 55 buildings in 45 countries. We speak 35 languages as an organization. Primarily, we have one of the most extensive MPLS networks worldwide, covering 3,000 cities, available in over 150 countries, and we reside in the top 10 carriers worldwide for IDD voice termination. But our DNA is very much made up from being a wholesale provider. That is where our, I guess, reputation has been built over the last 10 years, and PCCW Global as a business is roughly 10 years old, so it's had tremendous growth over that period as well. But we're very much an international wholesale organization. And again, you can sort of see from that is that we have the ability to deliver, I guess, this localization requirements that we need. In terms of our UCaaS offer, we really have kind of two main flavors for it. Again, building on what Matt put down earlier, which is the ability to extend your platform. So if you're a regional operator and you have services in one particular country, or maybe a kind of theatre like North America, we give you the ability to plug your network into your UCaaS capabilities, into our global capabilities, and extend your market reach. It allows you to do many of the things Matt described as effectively the areas that we may wish to avoid. So reduces your capital demands in order to build your own service, allows you to deploy a beachhead in far quicker timeframes than would normally be available to you. But also the fact that we have our own orchestration capabilities allows you to build unique packages and services for you to deliver to your customer, or more importantly, to mirror what you're offering them in your home market. And in doing that, that allows you to provide a consistent service across the globe to your customers. For some people, we're providing them with the ability to be able to provide a complete turnkey white labeled solution. Again, not just providing the raw components of the features and functionality that's available within a BroadWorks platform, but the ability for them to be able to bill, invoice, manage, provision, and deliver the service through a complete white labeled OSS and BSS capability. Just building on that a little bit further, our capabilities are quite broad and deep. We run a global BroadWorks platform. We have a North American capability, we have a European and EMEA capability, and we have a Asian capability. So 3 nodes linked and deployed on top of one of the most expansive MPLS networks on the planet, with over 200 NNI partnerships worldwide. So that gives us the ability to deliver the full and rich service of BroadSoft capabilities, but also to be able to deliver all of the components around the OSS and BSS parts of the solution as well. We'd very much like to talk to you and give you a bit more information about it. As I say, we'll be delivering a white paper as part of this and introducing you to the various different account teams.
Thanks very much, Scott. If anybody has any questions, I'm just checking if they've any appeared in my chat. None have appeared at the moment, but if anybody's got any questions on the last slide here, we'll be sending out the white paper, but you've got Scott's details here, and also you had my details at the beginning, but we'll be sending out those to you. So if I haven't got any questions, if anybody feels like they need to ask us, just put it into the chat. If not, with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attendance. We really appreciate it. And as I say, any questions, feel free to follow up with us afterwards. We'll be sending a white paper to all of you, which summarises a lot of what you've heard today. And also there'll be a recording of this webinar available as well. So I guess it just, with no questions appearing, I guess it just falls to me to thank you all for your attendance, and I look forward to meeting you all again soon. Thank you very much. Oh, Jerry, yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.